Here, in the Belgian town of Ypres, a prize fought over during the 4 long years of the First World War, stands a monument to the 130,000 men of the Indian Army who were rushed to fight in the Western Front in 1914 in order to reinforce the hard-pressed British Army. The Indian Army was recruited in the main in the Punjab and was made up of Muslims, Sikhs and Hindus. In this episode of The Great War, A War to End Wars, we look at the contribution of Muslim soldiers fighting for the British Army. Joining us are Dr. Gajendra Singh of Kellogg College of Oxford University, the author of The Testimonies of Indian Soldiers in the Two World Wars, and Gordon Corrigan, a former officer in the British Army, a military historian, and author of Sepoys in the Trenches, the Indian Corps on the Western Front, 1914 to 15. Gajendra, what was the scale of the mobilisation of the Indian Army during the First World War?
Well, what you have in various stages is the increase of the Indian Army from a small peacetime colonial policing establishment of a few 100,000 before 1914 to 1.7 million by the end. Not all of the 1.7 million actually are combatants, so about 900,000 see combat. Others are recruited in the Indian Labour Corps and various other units. So it's quite large. It's larger than all the Dominions and Celtic nations combined. So it's quite a large force.
Why was the Indian Army sent to France?
The reason is that you have very small peacetime army in Britain. So you have this, the British Expeditionary Force is quite small as well, and formed out of Britain's peacetime army. And so really from 1913 you start having discussions in the British military hierarchy, and certainly the British imperial hierarchy. Bear in mind Kitchener was quite heavily involved in British war planning, and Kitchener had been the commander-in-chief of the Indian Army, was a great advocate of the Indian Army itself. So from 1913 you start having this planning that maybe we ought to use Indian Army units to supplement the British Expeditionary Force, and that decision is taken finally in July 1914. So what's called the Indian Expeditionary Force A, I think, is sent as part of the initial British Expeditionary Force here. So one looks at this British contribution to France in the early months of the war. A third of it is Indian, as part of the pre-war planning about what to do in case of war.
Well, the British Army that went across to France in August 1914, when the British had decided to divert from their traditional policy of controlling the seas and just nibbling on land, the decision was made to take part in the war on land. The British Expeditionary Force, which at the time and since has been described as the best trained, the best led, the best equipped troops ever to leave these shores. That's probably true, but it was pitifully small. 4 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division and an independent brigade. The French produced 62 infantry divisions and 10 cavalry brigades. So obviously if Britain was going to have any effect on the war on the Western Front, there had to be reinforcements. Now, of course, in due course, the territorial force would come on stream, but that wouldn't be yet. It wasn't sufficiently trained or equipped. Not all its members had signed up for overseas service. The Dominions in due course would play an important part, but that wouldn't be yet. The Australian army was less than 1,000 strong in 1914. So the only source of trained regular manpower was the Indian Army, which was almost as big as the British Army and was trained, had experience of active service, all volunteers, knew what they were doing. It had to be India. There was no other source of reinforcements at that stage of the war.
How important was their role in 1914-15?
It was very important in those early stages. It was said at the time that they'd saved the empire in 1914. I think that's a slight exaggeration. What they certainly did was save the BEF, because they arrived in September 1914 in just enough quantities and just in time to plug those gaps around the Ypres salient. If the Germans had broken through, and there was nobody else to fill those gaps, if the Germans had broken through and were approaching the Channel ports, then the British would have had to leave the continent. Now that doesn't mean that we'd have lost the war, because being kicked out of Europe makes the British more grumpy rather than less, but it does mean that it would have taken an awful lot longer to win it. So it was very important in 1914 and in 1915. By the end of 1915, the Dominion armies had come on strength. The British Army itself had expanded enormously. The territorial force was involved, so they weren't so important then, which is why most of them were moved to Mesopotamia, where there was a real requirement for them.
These were volunteers?
They were. Although the thing about the Indian Army is that, the colonial Indian Army, is that it had quite convoluted recruiting practices, and these recruiting practices become even more convoluted during the First World War. So, certainly before the First World War, you have largely volunteer recruitment. By 1917, we have quite documented forms of coercive recruitment of individuals being lined up here in the burning sun and being told, you'll stand here until some of you come forward to enlist here. Of individuals even being beaten here and threatened here if they did not enlist here. And that's simply because it's largely because no one really wants to die. Right? And there was quite a lot of knowledge by 1917 in large parts of India that this is not a war you want to get involved in here. Although you have a volunteer army, and it is a volunteer army, given this appellation volunteer army, it's not necessarily wholly non-coercive.
Was Indian Army recruitment concentrated in particular regions?
Absolutely, yes. The Indian Army was in no way representative of the population of India. It wasn't then, it isn't now. It was recruited from what the British considered to be the martial classes, the martial races. Now that's probably an unfashionable belief these days, to say that some races can do something better than other races, but actually common sense tells you, if you're having to go over the top, what do you want behind you? Do you want 100 Spaniards or do you want 20 Sikhs? Now, if you're opening a restaurant, you want to recruit a lot of waiters, you might come to a different conclusion, but I know who I'd have. And these were people who, over the decades, over the centuries, even before the British ever came to India, they had been soldiers. And this was something that was passed down in the family. That's what they did, that's what they believed in. Military honour was important, and they could do the business, and that's why the British recruited them.
Gajendra, why was it that particular regions were really concentrated on the recruitment to the Indian Army?
So if one looks at the 1.7 million that are enlisted, just under half, about 800,000, are recruited from Punjab alone, from this one province in northwestern India. That's now straddles India and Pakistan. And that is justified by quite convoluted colonial racial theory. This idea that only certain Indians, certain South Asians are fit enough for manly martial activity, that are the equal of Europeans here. And there's three real reasons as to why that's so. So you have a very convoluted climactic theories of race that are at play. The idea that it's only individuals that are exposed to cold air that maintain their Aryan nature, right? So you have cold winters in Punjab, therefore they are martial. There's the idea that people who are agrarian, or as agrarian as possible, or preserve a level of martialness. Because this idea, of course, that the Indians are degenerate Aryans, that they were once white but since become black or something, or whatever you want to define it here. And so you have this idea of agrarianness, the idea that the further you are away from the Indian city and the deleterious effects of the Indian cityscape here, the more martial you are. And then this idea of religion and caste as well. The idea of certain castes, certain tribes, the idea of Pathans, being more martial than others.
And what proportion of the Indian Army was Muslim?
Actually, a lot. So if one looks at the largest, so probably about half, actually. If one looks at the largest martial race that's recruited by the British is Punjabi Muslims, Punjabi Muslims. So in terms of combatants, about 400,000 Muslims are recruited. Others, you're talking about Hindus, very convoluted, very idiotic categories that British construct. So you construct a race of the Hindustani Muslim or Musliman, the Deccani Musliman, Deccani Muslimans being recruited from Hyderabad, areas of southern India. Hindustani Muslimans being recruited from what's now UP, around Delhi and the areas around Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, also Madhya Pradesh as well. So these parts of areas. The Muslim is constructed in the British imagination as a race.
The Punjab was key to this recruitment.
They generally were, they were all from the north, except for Marathas who were from the centre, but generally from the north. The Punjabi Mussulman was regarded as the backbone of the Indian army. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't particularly sexy, but he was a good, solid soldier who got on with his business. And perhaps he wasn't as exotic as the Sikh or the Gurkha, but he was a jolly good soldier who got on with the business.
What percentage of the Indian army was Muslim?
But looks at Punjabi Muslims here, it's certain castes and groups of Punjabi Muslims that are regarded as more martial than others. So look at Niyazis, for instance. Niyazis are very heavily recruited into the army. And Niyazis come from 12 villages originally. So it's very small, very focused here, recruitment here, down to the Tehsil, down to this sub-district level, about where you could find certain martial races. And yeah.
Why was it, Gordon, there was no nationalist surge in the Indian army?
Yes, I mean the Congress Party in India, right at the beginning of the First World War, announced that they fully supported the British. So there really wasn't any nationalist influence at all. That comes later. Although even in the Second World War, it didn't really affect the army very much. Now, the politicians said, oh, well, that's because the army are recruited from uneducated people, and there's a certain amount of truth in that. But there's certainly no nationalism in the First World War. There were people, Indian expats in America, for example, who thought that India shouldn't be involved in the war, that it wasn't their war, but they really had no effect at all on the attitudes of the army.
Ginger, the British army was worried about the mood among its Indian troops.
This is a legacy of 1857, of the Indian mutiny, as it were. And you have this surviving legacy of India and also of colonialism more broadly being a space of both of fantastical opportunity but also of imminent anxiety as well. So the idea, the appearance and the recruitment of Indian soldiers becomes both a fulfillment of imperial fantasy and inspiring imperial neuroses about, well, what this armed Indian is, what it becomes. You have the reason why you start having the monitoring of Indian soldiers' correspondence in France is that as they arrive in Marseille, there's a particular Indian revolutionary movement that starts trying to bombard them with leaflets. That's intercepted, and that suddenly awakens this British intelligence to the prospect that these soldiers might be suborned while in France. Added to that is the fact that you have the Ottoman entry into the war in, well, October 1914 actually. So it's when you have the Germans under the Ottoman flag bombarding the Russian fleet at Odessa. And that's while these Indian soldiers are en route to France. And many of them being Muslim. Yes. So you have this double anxiety of, well, what does this mean for these soldiers?
There was a circular letter circulating among Indian troops in France and Belgium.
The key thing is that you have, for a century and a half before, within South Asia, forms of religious revivalism occurring at a very elite level and a very local level. So you have sort of elite religious revivalism that occurs at a level of, within Islam, at a level of establishing certain madrasas, that having particular discourse between rival ulama, and so on and so forth. But you also have the level of the street debate here, the level of the punch-up, the level of a very intimate sense of religion becoming important. In that, from the early 19th century, soldiers become quite important. Soldiers are, for any colonial state, colonial soldiers, are instrumental in trying to exert a certain form of colonial policy. In India, Islam became important, particularly the Islam being practiced by soldiers, because it's a way to actually exert colonial influence into the space of the Indian home and hearth, which would otherwise be closed off. That if one could adjust the religiosity of soldiers, one could affect peoples at home. So this is the idea that's at play, but also it could work in reverse, right? I mean, soldiers were being recruited from spaces that were not really being touched by this elite level of religious discourse, but being touched by this popular level of discourse, of dream sequences, of ideas that there's the imminent day of judgment, and so on and so forth. And this letter, what you start having among soldiers is circulation, the crystallization of this non-elite.
And this chain letter was written in very clearly Islamic terms of opposition to the war.
In addition to this tendency of soldiers as these conduits and catalysts between certain religious foreign movements, it also reflects war trauma as well. Right? I mean, you have among British soldiers in First World War, you have similar chain letters that also about religion, and also about fused religiosity, also about this modern war surely being about the Day of Judgment, surely being the end of days. And it is important to think about the nature of the war that these soldiers were suddenly being flung into. The Indian soldiers were being recruited really to fight low-intensity border conflicts, particularly with the Afghans, right? So that's why they're being recruited. Then suddenly they journey into France and experience the horrors of a modern war, but it's not even a modern war. It's almost like this weird conflation between the modern and the but almost in a way, as much as you start having Indian soldiers who are lancers here, so they are there on horseback with a lance, and what they're meant to do when they see a tank. Yeah, it's a very odd kind of steampunk conflict in many ways. You have this bizarre sort of conflation between the fantastical and the modern.
One of the issues raised was relations with the French civilian population.
So you start having the Indian Army in 1916, they're being pressured by the French government. You start having the Indian Army allowing, in 1916, marriages between Muslim Indian soldiers and French women. That's done because there's this belief that Muslims are naturally more lascivious, naturally more sexually charged, therefore need some outlet here. Therefore, we have to allow them at least here to marry French women. That begins to become the source of anxiety, and it ties into the letter as well. This chain letter becomes reflective of and reflecting this anxiety of what it means then to marry, not just to have the interracial marriage, but to have the interreligious marriage. Is this a threat to Islam? What does this mean for our identity as Muslims, for our identity as Indians, for our identity as colonial soldiers? And it's part of this wider sense of colonial identity being under flux and being in tumult here during the First World War.
Did this represent a hardening of Islamic identity during the war?
What you start having really from 1914, again, it's at an elite level and a non-elite level. And the elite level, you start having the idea of what it means here when we are being involved in this war. What the purposes of this war? What does it mean for us to be involved in it here? What does it mean in particular when we are being asked to fight in the Desert al-Arab, in the island of the Arabs, as it were, in this holy soil of Arabia against other Muslims? So you don't have that at a very elite level. So we start having subscriptions being raised to raise money for the Ottomans in India from 1914. This is almost a non-elite counterpart to it. You start having individuals who are not reading this literature in printed word, but are yet aware of this, are yet aware of the troubling nature of what this war in particular meant. And so you start having the idea of trying to preserve the inner and the outer body of Islam. So the idea of correct personal conduct suddenly becomes important. Not just the sect, but the idea of keeping the fast in the trenches. The idea of making sure that we do give zakat to the poor. In addition to the personal, you start having the idea of trying to preserve the outer body as well. So you start having this linkage between stopping individuals having sex in France with trying to think about what we can do to try and stop the war in the Middle East. So you have the First World War becomes a way where you have people who are coming from the absolute periphery in India suddenly becoming transnationalized, suddenly becoming aware of Islam as a global reach of Islam, of individuals becoming conscious of themselves as Muslim rather than just Punjabi and so on.
In 1915, the Indian Army was subsequently transferred to Iraq. What followed there?
It's transferred simply because, you have debacles, the initial military debacles, So you start having Indian presence like Gallipoli as well, You have it, so it's not just Mesopotamia or Iraq, it's Palestine as well. You start having large large Indian presence there, particularly cavalry. You have simmering discontent with the idea of what war against the Ottomans means from 1915 onwards, the very early months of 1915, as news comes forth of the Ottomans joining the war. Added to that, you have German propaganda, right? You have the conscious attempts of the Germans to propagandize around this issue. In fact, the Germans actually siphoned off Muslim soldiers here, both both Muslim soldiers recruited by the French and by the British, in separate PW camps in Germany, which are called half-moon camps. Right? The idea that where you are Muslims here, we are fighting with the Sultan, therefore you have to fight for us. Right? This idea of trying to propagandize on the basis of a common Islamic identity. It wasn't that effective, really, but it helps to adjust the language about how one begins to think about this and talk about this. You have one particular mutiny that is significant, which is the mutiny of the 15th Lancers, who are in France, and then late 1915 they're being diverted to Mesopotamia to join a real large Indian push into Mesopotamia to annex Iraq from the British. And they disembark in Basra and they mutiny straight away. And it was meant to be a mutiny where they would try and take up arms against the British, but they become disarmed and they're sent off to a penal colony in the Andaman Islands. It doesn't really end up, well, no mutiny ends up that well, but this one in particular doesn't really go down, doesn't really last very long.
This was where they placed the Quran on their heads.
Well, we have that in social letters here. You have the idea of how they are trying to organize a mutiny. So you have soldiers' letters who are involved in the mutiny talking about taking an oath upon the Quran, and it's an oath about but the fact that they cannot fight in this space. In fact, many would actually later on volunteer to fight in East Africa. So there's something in particular about the soil of Arabia where they could not fight.
And also against fellow Muslims.
It's also about that, but it's also about the soil itself. Yeah? It's about this soil, the soil where you have Mecca and Medina. It itself is holy. It's not just the idea of fighting against Muslims. Yeah? Because after all, in East Africa, some of the individuals who would be fighting against would be Muslim, right? So something in particular about the land itself that becomes important. And it's tied into what you have later on is the Caliphatist movement that emerges after the First World War in South Asia. We have, and becomes tied to the first push for Indian independence, we have a movement emerging to combat British colonialism in the Middle East. It's a very odd anti-colonial movement, but that's what happens in South Asia. It becomes tied to this early simmerings of this Caliphatist tendency or belief or sentiment.
What changes did the return of soldiers bring to India after the war?
I'm not sure very much did change. I think a lot changed in the Second World War, and I think the changes that happened between the wars really had very little to do with the war itself. After all, the nationalist politicians weren't soldiers because they tended to be from races that weren't recruited. So I think what changed was education, of course, wider education in India, breakdowns in some areas of British administration, things like the Amritsar massacre, which was actually fairly minor, really, but of course was blown up. So that's really what changes things. I think. I don't think the First World War had much effect, whereas of course the Second World War did.
What was the impact of the returning soldiers?
So we have stories about 1922 and a particular massacre in this village. There are two soldiers there, or two former soldiers there. We know that maybe in Jallianwala Bagh there are a few soldiers there. Yeah. You have this fleeting appearance of this former soldier being apparent here or apparent there. You don't have a sustained soldiers movement. The exception probably would be Punjab, where in 1919 you do have quite a lot of demobilization violence that becomes tied into violence against what are called the Rowlatt Acts, which are these acts that the British create to try and extend wartime measures into perpetuity, which will basically restrict freedom of assembly, censorship of the press, and so on and so forth. And that becomes justification for Jallianwala Bagh or Amritsar massacre. It's justified in terms of you have the martial body rebelling, you have history of revolutionary movements, that we have these bodies that we cannot constrain, that have military training, that we have to have this salutary lesson of the massacre to actually calm things down. So Punjab's the exception, but Punjab was always the exception, simply because it was this colonial garrison state for the British in India, and indeed for the empire as a whole.
In the next episode of The Great War, A War to End Wars, we will look at how Britain looked after Muslim soldiers killed or wounded in the war, and how their sacrifice is commemorated today.